In this video, we're going to look at percents, decimals, and fractions with grids. Shade the indicated quantity and rewrite in the indicated forms. Write the fraction with a denominator of 100 and also a simplified fraction when appropriate. So let's look at the first one. We have 57 hundredths, and this square is our unit. The big square is the unit, which means that it represents 1. Okay? Each small square represents 1 out of 100. And since it's a square, each column has 10 small squares, so each column will be 10 out of 100. So let's first shade 57 hundredths. So that would be 57, so I'd need 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 entire columns. That would give me 50 hundredths. And then I'd need 7 more, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now the shaded region of the square is 57 hundredths, or 57 out of 100. So now let's write these in the corresponding forms. Well, 57 hundredths as a decimal is 0.57. So 5 tenths and 7 hundredths, or 57 hundredths. As a decimal, since each one of these is 1 100th, we have 57 copies of 1 100th, or 57 over 100. And now for percents, a percent represents an amount over 100, so 57 hundredths is 57%. Okay, so 1% equals 0.01 100th, or equivalently 1 over 100. So if we have 57 hundredths as a percent, it's 57%, or 57 per 100. Let's look at the next one. We're asked to shade 7 for every 20. So I am going to look at these as every 2 columns is 20. So out of every 2 columns, I'm going to shade 7. So this is 7 out of the first 20. Now I'm looking at, let's just draw a few little lines here. So here to the left is 20 going all the way down. Okay, so I'm breaking them into groups of 20. And now for this 20, I'll shade 7. For this 20, I'll shade 7. And here, and finally here. So notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups of 20, and I shaded 7 for every group. Okay, so that means there's 7 times 5, which is 35 small squares shaded. And since each small square represents 100th, as a decimal, this is 0.35. Okay. First, I'm going to write the fraction out of 100, which is 35 out of 100. And the simplified fraction, we could actually read from the directions. So 7 for every 20 means 7 over 20. Okay. So these two fractions are equivalent fractions. Notice if I multiply the denominator and the numerator by 5, I would get this fraction. Then once we have it over 100, it's easy to rewrite as a percent. 35 hundredths is 35 per 100, or 35%. Let's look at the next slide. Here we're asked to shade 6 tenths and 5 hundredths. So I'm going to shade the tenths using an orange pen. So this is 1/10. Okay, So if you look at this column relative to the unit, this is 1 out of 10 of the unit. Notice it's also equivalent to 10 100ths. So I'm going to shade 3, 4, 5, 6. So the 6/10 is shaded orange. And now we have 5 hundredths more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is 6/10 and 5 hundredths of this unit. Now, to write this as a decimal, okay, we can see that there's 65 hundredths shaded, so this would be 0.65. As a fraction out of 100, this is 65 hundredths, so 65 over 100. As a simplified fraction, notice the numerator and denominator are both divisible by 5 because they end in 5 or 0. So 65 divided by 5 is 13, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So as a simplified fraction, 13 over 20, or 13/20ths of the grid is shaded. And to write the percent, it's easiest to look at the fraction out of 100, 65 over 100, or 65 per 100, or percent. And finally, let's look at D, 120 per 100. Well, this is interesting because you might think, how can we have 120 per 100? 120 is larger than 100. Okay, but you could think you could drive 120 miles per every 100 minutes. Okay, so we can compare two values like we've seen before, where the first value that we're comparing is larger than the measuring stick we're using, the second value. So, since this grid is 100 100ths, I will shade this entire grid to get 100 out of 100. And then we need another 20. So this is 100, and each column is 10, so this is 120 hundredths. Now remember, this isn't 120 out of 200. This is still our unit. So it's 120 out of 100. Now as a decimal, we have one whole grid shaded, which is 1. And this is 2/10ths, or 20 out of 100, so we could write it as 1.2, or equivalently 1 20 hundredths. Okay. As a fraction out of 100, we have 120 per 100, or 120 over 100. If we want to simplify this fraction, I'll do this in a few steps. So first, I see they're both divisible by 10 because they end in 0. So if we divide them both by 10, the numerator and denominator, we have 12 over 10. And now these are still both even, so I could divide by 2. And you could divide by 20 the first time if you wanted. So this will be 6/5. So 120 over 100 is equivalent to 6/5. And as a percent, we can look at the fraction out of 100, and we have 120 per 100, or percent.